Inequality Podcast, the podcast on inequality research.
Welcome to a new episode of the Inequality Podcast. My name is Marius Busemeyer. I'm a professor of Comparative Political Economy and speaker of the Excellence Cluster Politics of Inequality here at the University of Constance. And here is
Gabriele Spilker. I'm a professor of international politics and co-speaker of our cluster.
And as a guest today, we have David Rueda. He is a professor of comparative politics at Oxford University and also a fellow at Nuffield. He has worked a lot on the politics of redistribution, especially on the role of unions, social democratic parties, but also more recently on perceptions of fairness and how that's related to the political economy of redistribution. And most importantly, he is here as a senior fellow of the Excellence Cluster. So welcome, David, for this podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. I look forward to this conversation.
Very good. So let's get started. Maybe we can start with a rather broad and general question. So in your work, what I find really interesting is that you show that people under certain conditions actually accept inequality and even think it's fair to some extent, right? I mean, that sounds pretty surprising because if you think about the politics of inequality and you don't know nothing about it, you would think everybody hates inequality or consider it as unfair. But you actually find that sometimes people think inequality is fair. How is that possible?
So I think that the work that I'm doing extends some of the things that we already know about fairness and about deservingness. So it is in fact the case that the general sort of consensus in the literature of sort of support for distribution agrees that when inequality is perceived as the result of some fair procedure, in fact, sort of it reflects effort and merit, people are very much ready to accept a degree of inequality. But when inequality is perceived as being the result of something unfair, or in fact something just luck related, then people are much more likely to want to mitigate that inequality and to sort of take from the rich to give to the poor and produce sort of a degree of redistribution.
Yeah.
So that's part of what we do in terms of how can we explore sort of why exactly or how these perceptions of fairness or deservedness affect people's support for things like the welfare state, redistribution, taxation, transfers to the poor.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, so
That would have been my question, David, before we go on and ask about meritocracy and these kind of things, is to explain our listeners a little bit more about what redistribution entails, what different facets you look at. What if you say the politics of redistribution, what do you mean with that? What types of phenomenon are we looking at?
Yeah. So I think that there is a very general way of thinking about this, which has to do with the general sort of support or lack of support for the things that are redistributed that sort of the government can provide, whether that is a welfare state, public services, health, education. What we do is something much more concrete, which is common to some of the literature on the political economy of redistribution, which is to think about whether people support a system in which there are taxes and there are transfers, right? So it's this simplified world in which we all pay taxes, but we all pay taxes that go into a general sort of pool. And then that money that goes into the taxation then is redistributed by giving it back to people. And of course, this is a simple, elegant way of thinking about it, but it could apply to services in the sense that we all pay for something, but some people are more benefited by the services or use more of those services. So in reality, we're thinking, even in the most simplified way of thinking about this tax transfer system, when we all pay, say, the same proportion of our income to taxes, this is put into a pool and then is distributed as a sort of a lump sum to everyone. This would be redistributive because, of course, the rich pay more than they get from the system, and the poor get more from the system than they pay as taxes. So it is redistributive. And now the question is, to what extent do some people support this more than others? And there are two themes that are also sort of part of the work that we do in terms of the motivation behind this kind of redistributive system. One is that it is a materials of interest, right? So there is something very intuitive about thinking that, well, the rich do not benefit as much as they pay. The poor benefit more than they pay. Therefore, it's going to be all about income, who supports redistribution and who doesn't. But then the fairness sides come in the sense that there is a baseline that has to do with income. The rich do in general support redistribution less than the poor in all industrialized democracies. But then there is something else which is interesting and important to explain, which is to what extent do we deviate from that baseline that is purely materially self-interested? And is there something about perceptions of fairness and perceptions of deservingness? To what extent do people think that inequality is something that itself should be mitigated or not, even though they may benefit or not personally or individually from the redistributive system?
Okay, I see. So these fairness perceptions, they basically go in two directions, so to speak. So on the one hand, if you think that inequality is to some extent fair because it's based on hard work, then it's a legitimization of inequality. But it can also go the other way around, that the rich say, okay, it's fair that the poor also get something from this cake that we are producing here, so to speak. So is that the way you're thinking about this? I mean, the rich also think it's fair that some of the poor, you mentioned deservingness, maybe again under certain conditions, they also have to contribute something to the welfare state. Or what does your research tell us there?
Absolutely. So this is part of the question, right? So to what extent is it is the fact that I perceived inequality to be fair or unfair related to whether I move away from this material self-interested baseline of either I benefit or do not benefit from redistribution, and therefore there are several reasons why this perception of fairness may matter. It may be that we think it's fair for a system that rewards the hardworking and the talented, because that's good for everyone, right? So this is an economy that is going to be efficient and productive. We all benefit from the fact that the people who work really hard are rewarded through their market income, and the people who don't work as hard are not rewarded by as much market income. But then there are all things which are more sort of normative in the sense of whether I think inequality is a good thing or not, separately from whether I think it is something that is good for the economy or not good for the economy. So we try to get at some of these things in terms of both perceptions of inequality and modifying people's perception of what inequality is, and seeing whether there are normative sort of distinctions. But then also in sort of lab experiments that then have a very clear way of producing an income in the lab that then we can connect to whether you support redistribution more or less. And part of this, again, is very much this idea that if you accept this idea that there is a baseline in terms of redistribution that has to do with whether you benefit from it or not, and therefore income is a very sort of relevant determinant of support redistribution, then there are, both in my work with Daniel Stegmuller and the work that I've done with Verena Fetscher and now with Noah Dassin, then there is definitely an implication that this normative conception, or that the importance of fairness, may in fact be different for the rich and for the poor.
Okay.
Because in some ways, right, sort of for the poor, fairness and material self-interest work in the same direction. The moment that I think inequality is something that affects me and I support redistribution because I would benefit from redistribution, the higher the level of inequality is. At the same time, if I have a normative inclination to dislike inequality, or I think inequality is unfair, then that is going to really push me in the same direction of supporting redistribution. But for the rich, then we have this interesting division of materials of interest and fairness perceptions. And a lot of the action that we see when we look at observational data, meaning surveys, asking people whether they support redistribution and asking them whether they are, what their income is, whether they're relatively rich or relatively poor, is that a lot of the variation and a lot of the action really is about the affluent and the rich. Because they can either support redistribution more or less, there is a lot of variation, and here is perhaps where materials of interest and perceptions of fairness work in different directions, and therefore they affect some affluent more than others and make them more or less likely to support redistribution.
That's super interesting. And before we go into the details of what you do in the lab and tell our listeners what the lab really is, I have one more question, I think, on the affluent and on the question of what type of redistribution we are looking at. Because I can see one additional reason that is more sociotropic in nature, but not fairness related, in the sense that the rich might support certain forms of redistribution, and particularly education, not because of fairness concerns, but because of a more broadly defined self-interest, in terms of that they might think that more education might make the cake bigger for everyone and they will therefore profit too, right? So there would, independent of their fairness concerns, which might be different for different types of redistribution you look at, where welfare benefits might be something where they really think like, okay, either I have these fairness concerns or I don't have them. But for education, I see an additional self-interest that is not a really egotropic or very individual self-interest, but a more national self-interest type of story. Is that something you can detect, or is that something you see in your work or in work of others?
Yes. I think that conceptually, there are different reasons why the rich may care about inequality in a way that seems to be fairness related, because it's not purely related to the material self-interest, but in reality, it could actually be a more complicated conception
exactly.
of their material self-interest. Right? So as you were saying, so if we take a very simplified version of this, the affluent or the rich do not immediately benefit from redistribution because they pay more than they get. Now, of course, as a number of political economy arguments have put forward, including sort of the work of Marius and others, the moment that we move away from the present and we consider also the possibility of the future, the rich today may be concerned that they're not going to be rich tomorrow. And to the extent that they are, in fact, concerned about the possibility of needing redistribution tomorrow, the insurance side of the material self-interested motivation for support redistribution becomes quite strong. And therefore, they may support redistribution not because of any conception of fairness. They may think fairness, inequality is completely fair. But they think of redistribution today as insurance tomorrow, and therefore they support redistribution. That is something that is also connected to the sociotropic argument that you present, because of course, there is the possibility that by looking at others and others that I identify with and seeing whether they are more or less likely to become vulnerable to poverty or going down sort of the income distribution in the future, I then take that to be a signal of what may happen to me, and I become more likely to support redistribution, not because I care about others or because I care about the fairness, but because I identify their situation as something that gives me a signal about insurance. But at the same time, this is difficult, right? So this is one of the reasons why sometimes sort of surveys or observational data can tell us about these general sort of patterns and relationships, but it's very difficult to get at what exact mechanism is working. Because of course, this is very difficult to distinguish from an argument in which I care about others. And it's not that I'm understanding their situation to be a signal about my future, but it's really because I care about their circumstances. And it's purely, we're part of the group and I care about them, and therefore I support high redistribution, not because of me individually, but because of others. Or it could be, again, that there is something that is material self-interested because I understand that when people of my group who are deserving receive redistribution, we actually produce a more productive, effective, efficient sort of economy, because, none of the people that I identify with would take advantage of redistribution or the welfare state, because we're all sort of, fundamentally sort of good people. And it's only when we think about non-in-group people and them getting this redistribution that some of this lack of deservingness factors may come in. So several things about the identity of others, whether the group is identified as something that is purely material self-interested, insurance or redistribution related, or other motivations become important in this story. And therefore, that's the reason why it's sort of digging deeper, both in terms of surveys that are more causally identified, but also in the lab, maybe an interesting thing.
Maybe I can just, because you also have to, in some previous work, you also look at the role of crime in all of in the story, right? Maybe we could say also something about that, because in a way, it could also be that rich people support the welfare state because they are worried about crime, right? They think, okay, if there's more inequality, there are more poor people around, so they might actually come and rob my house. And that's, of course, also one of these cases where you say, well, is that really fairness? Is it altruism? Is it actually some kind of broader self-interest at play here? But you also work on this link between crime and support for redistribution. So what does that tell us about this complex association?
A part of the work that I've done with Daniel Stickmiller before just looks at surveys, and both in Europe and in the US, and makes this argument that one of the reasons why the rich may support redistribution is material, self-interested, but not really related to the tax and transfer calculation, purely economic, how much do I pay and how much do I get from the redistributive system. But it may be about one of the sort of negative externalities of inequality, and if that negative externality of inequality is crime, right? If I have, as a rich person, I perceive high inequality to be correlated with a higher vulnerability that I will be vulnerable to crime, then I may want to support higher redistribution, because in fact, I think that limits the amount of inequality and therefore limits the possibility that I will be vulnerable to crime in the future. And we clearly see this when we look at sort of local levels of inequality, regional levels of inequality, and we look at people, sort of the affluent, the concern with crime that the affluent may have, and it's both, there is a connection between macro levels of inequality and how concerned they are about crime, and then how important their concerns for crime are about supporting redistribution.
I see. Okay.
So, and this is something that then we've done observationally in that side, and it's really sort of an interesting side of this redistribution versus incarceration or policing as another possible solution for the affluent to protect themselves from the negative externality of inequality. And it's something that then we take to the lab to try to get at it in a more sort of detailed way.
Maybe it's time to tell us a little bit more about how you go about this in practice. So you said repeatedly, sometimes you use observational data, survey data, sometimes you go to the lab. And I would just love to know, what is it that you do if you use observational data? That means you have existing survey data. What is it that you do then? And what can you do differently if you really go to the lab, which as a social scientist, not like a natural scientist or those who work on medicine or other related disciplines, I mean, do regularly. For us, that's often a bit something more innovative and novel. And so I would just love to hear more about what you do exactly.
So I think like a lot of political scientists doing political economy, there has been a movement in political science towards what we call sort of causal inference or causal identification. And which in my own case, I still do a lot of observational work. I think that observational work, whether it is survey-based or is historical or is case studies or is interviews, is incredibly valuable. It tells us a lot about patterns and about relationships. It is fundamental to what we do in political science. But at the same time, it has some limitations, like everything that we do in political science. And one of them may be that identifying the causes of a particular outcome is difficult, because when we look at observational data, lots of things go together. And therefore, identifying the exact thing that is responsible for variation in the outcome is complicated. So here is where the experimental sort of side of either doing surveys or doing it in the lab comes in, because it allows us to manipulate a particular cause artificially, as if it was a treatment in the sort of the medical sense, right? Sort of some people, we randomly give a treatment to some people rather than other people that we are analyzing. And then we can see, because of course it has been randomly distributed, that in fact nothing else, but the only thing that varies in a systematic way is what we have manipulated, the treatment. And therefore we can associate an outcome change to that treatment that we have provided. I do this in my work in two ways. In my work with Verena Fetcher, what I do is to do surveys and to expose people to some information and some other people not to that information. So what we're trying to do in that work is to analyze how important perceptions of inequality are. And what we do then is to update the information that people have about the level of inequality in their country in a random way. So that some people in a survey will be given that information, some people will be giving information about something that is not inequality related at all. And we can see whether updating people and making them conscious of the level of inequality in their country, which in our case in the UK means that telling people that inequality is higher than they thought it was, whether that then has an effect on the support for redistribution.
And does it have an effect?
Yeah, it has. It definitely has an effect, and it has an effect that has a lot to do with the conversation we've had before. What we see in that experiment, in that survey experiment, is that it is a very different effect for the poor and for the rich. So for the poor, which again, this is a survey, then for the poor, what it does is to essentially sort of reduce the variation in their support for distribution and make it stronger. So in here, because this normative side and the materials of interest side goes together, right? Sort of people understand they benefit from redistribution, and they may also have normative conceptions about inequality, fairness, and deservingness that are modified by the fact that we're telling them inequality is higher than they thought it was. So that they become sort of, the variation becomes smaller, everyone becomes more likely to support redistribution, and their support of redistribution gets higher. For the rich, however, it has the opposite variation effect, meaning that it increases the variation. So for the rich, there are some material self-interested ones that when we tell them inequality is higher than they thought, they understand that means that they're going to have to pay more for distribution than they would have to pay. And if they're purely material self-interested, then they become less likely to support redistribution. They don't like it. But for the ones that have fairness considerations, the fact that we're telling them that inequality is higher than they thought it was means that they become more interested in supporting redistribution, because the payoff that you get in this other regarding normative way from that redistribution is higher, or perhaps because, again, sort of we cannot distinguish these materials of interest side from the normative side, and they become more likely to support redistribution. So the average doesn't change that much, but the variation becomes much higher.
But how do you do that then in the lab, right? I mean, this is the survey world again, so you can just give some people information, others not. But I mean, these things that we talked about, fairness, considerations, crime. I mean, how can you do that in the lab? Do you ask people to steal from each other, or how do they?
Exactly. So the survey experiment is getting us closer to knowing exactly why it is that people may increase or decrease their support for distribution. And it's identified in the sense that we know that this information makes a difference because it has been sort of randomly given to some and not others, but it's not getting sort of close enough to the motivation of why it is that this could be the case or not. So in the lab, what we can do in the lab is to try to actually sort of get closer and closer to what the mechanism could be that is making the affluent and not the poor support redistribution more. So what we do is we bring people to a social science lab where they then essentially sort of engage in a sort of artificial sort of society kind of game with us, in which both they come in and then sort of they do an effort task that then determines what income they're going to get. And by income, we mean what is the payoff that they get from being engaged in this particular experiment in the lab. Some of them become rich because they've done well in the effort task. Some of them become poor because they have not done well in the lab. But now what we can also manipulate is whether there is a level of procedural fairness in the system itself, and therefore whether some people get their income because their effort and merit was high or low, and some people do the effort, but they get their income out of luck. Which is something that then again sort of we put together with the fairness sort of discussion. And then there is a third side of the treatment, which is people that don't do any work and they just get their income completely because of luck. So what we're trying to get at is to what extent, number one, does procedural fairness matter? Meaning sort of the fact that I'm in a system that either everyone gets their income the same way, we all have to work and then we get our income. Or some of us work and don't get our income because of the effort that we put into it, but completely out of luck. And some of us don't work at all. Some of us inherit, right, sort of their wealth or get their wealth out of luck, and it's a lottery, and they have this income and they haven't worked for it.
People play a computer game, right?
Yes, they do. The effort task in our case is something that we call sort of take out the trash or something like that, and it really is in a screen. You have lots of garbage that you have to put into a very small sort of garbage can. So it is a computer game in the sense that sort of and each garbage piece that you put into the can successfully becomes a point, and you get sort of more and more points the more garbage that you successfully put into the can. So that's the effort, and it's a very long one. We really want people to feel like they have done something that was not fun, but in fact sort of
Work.
so
Something
when you
like
do
work.
that for
Yeah.
when you do that for 12 minutes, you really feel like, oh
Yeah.
my God,
I
this is a
deserve.
lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, and therefore, right, sort of, and then, right, sort of, depending on how you've done, how many units, how many points you have, you are either in the poor or the rich side of things. If you are in the treatment, that is one in which you did the work, but now your income is being given by your merit, how well you did. You could be also in the treatment that you did the work. You didn't know whether you were going to be in one side or the other. You did it sincerely, hoping that your performance would be correlated with your income. But somehow, then you are in the treatment in which you get your income out of luck. And that means that you've done the work, but there is no connection between your talent or your merit and the income that you get. Or you can be a group that comes into the lab later. You don't do any of this work. You just sit down. You're told what the task is, and you get to practice the task. But you don't do it, and you get your income completely out of luck. And now you interact with others, and a rich person interacts with a poor person, and they choose taxation.
Mm-hmm.
Taxation that then is realized, meaning sort of that whatever taxation we choose, a poor and a rich person, one of them is chosen randomly and then is realized, which means that that taxation is the income that you made in the effort task is then taken away by that level of taxation, and there is a transfer. It's a pure sort of you tax and then you give us transfer to both people. So there is a sincere motivation.
Because at the end of the day, they really get money.
You get the money.
Okay.
Exactly. You get real money.
Yeah.
So the interesting thing is that in this very artificial lab experiment, in which essentially sort of we're talking about, the difference between, I don't know, something like 14 pounds and 30 pounds. In reality, what we see is something that is completely consistent what we see when we look at surveys. So for anyone having a suspicion that somehow in the lab, people are not going to care enough about, getting 10 pounds or 12 pounds versus 30 pounds, they do. And in fact, the rich, meaning the income rich in the lab, the people who did well, for example, in the task, got more income than the others, behave systematically different from the poor.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that fairness matters very differently to the rich and to the poor in the lab.
Yeah, I was just going to say, because of course, you said that multiple times, it's an artificial thing. Isn't this also, to some extent, a problem that people also have, of course, personalities and lives and identities in the real world, and then they don't leave these personalities necessarily at the door, but they have their views on society and inequality in their mind, then they play this game, and then they face a question at the very end, but of course, they have had their lives before. Are you not worried that the rest of the personality will totally dominate whatever they do in that game?
So we are worried about that, and therefore what we do is everyone, before they go into the lab, about 2 weeks before, between 2 weeks and sort of a few days before going to the lab, they do a survey for us. And in the survey, what we do is to ask them the typical questions that we have in observational surveys about their out of the lab income and their education and all the things that we normally ask, the socioeconomic characteristics and demographic characteristics that we also ask in a survey. And we also ask some questions that are related to some of the personality traits that may influence their behavior. Altruism and risk aversion being sort of the two that are the most important. For us, the important thing in some ways is to show, as you're saying, that sort of this concern about people bringing into the lab things that are fundamentally unrelated to the things that we are artificially creating for them in the lab is something that doesn't affect the results that we see. And the interesting finding from our survey side is that neither your political ideology, when you respond to the survey sort of 2 weeks before, or the income that you have in real life influences your support for distribution. Not even the support for distribution question that you have in the survey 2 weeks before is not correlated to what we do. Once you're in the lab, you behave as a poor or rich person in ways that are not related to that, but very much related to what we are manipulating for you. The thing that does make a difference, however, is this personality trait. The personality trait influences it in a way that we can control for them when we do the analysis of the lab. So it doesn't influence our main findings, but it is one of the few things that we carry from the survey that actually influences people's behavior in the lab.
And what does that all mean now for the more broader politics of redistribution? What to make out of these lab experiments if we want to understand or potentially design a system in which we want to potentially reduce inequality, or at least have it in a level that is fair for everyone, or that makes the best use of resources?
So I think that there are a number of things that we learn from the redistributive side of our lab experiment that are important to know if we are to design policies that take into consideration how people form their preferences and how they then are willing or not willing to sort of vote for taxation and for higher or low redistribution. One of them is that there is a difference between work and talent or merit, right? So we see in the lab that in fact, people respond to work in a very different way from when work is associated to merit. And this is something that is not completely straightforward always from the behavioral economics or the other political science sort of literature that exists, right? The fact that in many of the things that we've done, people just think work and merit are the same thing, right? So if you have a system that rewards work and merit, and therefore that is one that would therefore be associated with less support for redistribution than one that is sort of purely luck related. But in fact, sort of work is something that is recognized, and sort of when there is uncertainty about whether work is associated with income in a way that reflects merit, people then reward work with higher support for redistribution. And this is all about the rich and not the poor. We find, just like with the observational data, that the poor are consistently have higher support for redistribution, and that a lot of the variation, again, and sort of that matters in terms of support for redistribution is about the rich. And that also matters to our sort of political considerations once we take this to sort of the politics of redistribution, because promoting a lower level of polarization between the rich and the poor when supporting redistribution is something that matters to how sustainable redistribution can be. And in many ways, having the support of the redistribution for the poor being consistent, but finding what are the factors that make more and more of the rich support higher level of redistribution, that also matters to a kind of a coalition that is for redistribution in many of these countries. So we find that to be sort of important.
So you mean that the rich are more likely to support giving benefits, social benefits to the poor if they perceive them to be working hard, so to speak?
Exactly.
So this the whole welfare state, there in the social policy literature, there's this debate about work incentives, and in Germany we now have a big debate about the Bürgergeld, the social assistance scheme, where they increase the work incentives again after having actually reduced them for some time. So in a way, if you connect your argument to the bigger debate about the welfare state, this would imply to some extent, if you make the welfare state a little bit more focused on promoting work, that should also increase the support for this among the rich, and therefore potentially actually leads to a bigger welfare state.
So two things. I think that this introduces something about equality of opportunity rather than sort of equality of outcomes, in the sense that the perception of the fairness of the system matters to whether we think that then sort of work should be rewarded or not rewarded. But it is certainly the case that our findings also show that work is actually ambiguous in terms of its effect, because the argument that you're making is true. So as a rich person, I will support more redistribution for you if you work, but you have your income not determined by merit.
That's so
because
complicated.
The important thing between the important differentiation between work and merit is that work, when you work and then get your income by luck, means that you have worked, but you're not giving me a signal of whether you're deserving or not. If you work and you do badly, then me as a rich person think that you deserve what you get through the market, and therefore you don't deserve redistribution. So the idea of sort of somehow making sort of things more sort of dependent on work may not necessarily work the way that you were suggesting, because if work is associated with a perception that the outcome in terms of inequality is in fact a fair one, you didn't work, or you worked, but you performed badly in the market economy, then you deserve the low market income that you get. And that's exactly what we see in the lab. What we see in the lab is that the same rich people are exposed to one treatment, work and merit, say, okay, you did the same work that I did, and you did badly and I did well. You don't deserve redistribution because you just didn't do well in the effort task. But if people do the work, but then are given their income by luck, then the rich say, no, you deserve
Okay, but
redistribution.
that's also this idea of meritocracy, where you basically confuse it, or where people may confuse the outcome with the fairness of the process. So, for instance, if you, as a rich financial banker, say, well, I have a lot of money on my account, so I must have worked hard for that.
Yes.
So that's
exactly.
the criticism of meritocracy to some extent, right? That it's confusing the outcome with the process to some degree.
But also, so we get a lot of text, meaning sort of people justify their choices in the lab, and people are actually sort of quite willing to explain why it is that they made the decisions that they made in the lab. And what we also find very consistently, and one of the strong results in our lab experiment, is that everything is about the rich, and everything is about the rich, but it is about the deservingness of the poor that they are interacting with. The rich always assume, whatever outcome they're in, they always assume themselves to be effortful and meritful.
That's interesting. Yeah. They also think that even if they got it out of luck, so to say, or inherited it. That's super interesting. Yeah.
Exactly. So they always think, look, I was one of the luck ones, but had I done the effort, I would have been one of the good performers, right? Sort of, it's clear, sort of, I consider myself a high merit person. Therefore, you gave me my income through luck, but obviously, sort of, had I been in the other treatment, I would be rich anyways, right? So it's all about the poor. It's all about the treatment of the poor. When the rich interact with the poor, it's all about what signals do I get from the lab that you are either deserving or not deserving. And then that hierarchy is, okay, if you worked and you did badly, you deserve being poor and you don't deserve redistribution. If you worked but got your income through luck, then you deserve redistribution because you worked, but you could be one of the high performer ones. There is this uncertainty, this procedural uncertainty that makes me not. And if you didn't work and have your income given by luck, then you're one of the typical sort of, life is luck related, and therefore you deserve a degree of redistribution because you haven't shown whether you're deserving poor or not a deserving poor. So this is all interesting, I think, and important in terms of how we consider sort of the role of the welfare state. But the second thing that we do in the lab then is that, as a surprise, sort of after people have chosen redistribution and redistribution has been, in fact, sort of materialized in terms of their payoffs, we offer the poor a chance to steal from the rich. And we offer the rich a chance to invest in policing, which will increase the probability of the poor being caught if they engage in stealing from the rich. And this is the second part of sort of trying to sort of think about the negative externalities of inequality, but also more importantly, in terms of Gabby's question about sort of the real life connection of this, it really is also about to what extent does policing and incarceration affect the level of redistribution? What balance between redistribution and policing would sort of the affluent and the rich want? We haven't done a systematic analysis of our policing and stealing side of the game, because we're writing sort of the papers and the research that have to do with redistribution first. But what we find is really sort of two kind of equilibria that are very much the kind of stereotypical sort of Scandinavian versus American sort of stereotypes. So the rich who underinvest in redistribution in the first side of the experiment then are very concerned that the poor are going to steal from them in the second side of the experiment. And they end up investing a lot in policing because they're very concerned about the possibility that the poor are going to steal from them. The rich that have invested a high amount in redistribution to begin with then feel no incentive whatsoever to spend a lot of money on policing. So when the second stage comes in, they do not invest as much in policing. And what we have is that in reality, the rich end up spending more when they have tried not to support redistribution, because they end up spending so much in policing than what the rich that actually supported redistribution to begin with. So that at the end, sort of, they are in a better place. And what we also find is that the poor in any of the circles are quite reluctant to steal anyways. So the rich are very concerned about being stolen from, but the poor, both because stealing is sort of a normatively sort of unacceptable thing to do, but also because they feel concerned that if they steal, they may actually lose part of their endowment if they're caught because the rich person invested in policing. So the rich actually end up not stealing that much, but the rich can actually
Well.
spend a lot of money in this policing side in a kind of an Americans. I mean, we know from observation data how incredibly expensive incarceration and policing is in the US,
Yeah.
and how, in fact, sort of, a more generous welfare state is cheaper.
So, but that's a very optimistic or potentially beautiful result at the end of the day, no? In the sense that by investing more in redistribution, for one, everyone's life would be better, and it would also be cheaper in the aggregate, and we all would
Yes.
potentially live in a nicer and better world. That's I like that, David. Beautiful. Thanks for this.
That is a very nice, that is one of the optimistic sort of findings from the lab experiment, that you do have this side in which, when the rich, in fact, sort of are behaving sort of in a more pro-redistributive way, in reality, then what you get is much less of a necessity to invest in policing, much less of a concern about crime as a negative externality of inequality, and that this all sort of makes sense in terms of the observational data that we see. But once the rich realize the potential negative consequences of inequality, they're more likely to support redistribution, and that actually the redistributive side may be cheaper and more effective for a society than one in which the punitive side, you don't invest enough in promoting equality, and then you have to invest a lot because you feel very concerned. And there, in addition to the costs of private security and
Sure.
residential segregation, so that you're not sort of as vulnerable to crime, etc., and things that also would promote a worse set of societal outcomes in many ways, not only the equality one, but a much more polarized society.
Good. I mean, let's hope that this result holds up once you dig deeper into the data, but we're optimistic about that as well. Thank you very much for the time, David. It was a fantastic conversation, and thanks to the listeners for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Please remember, our podcast appears every first Wednesday in every month.
So look out for the next episode. Bye.
Absolutely.